Thanks everyone for joining. Like I said, it's so nice to see lots of familiar names in the and photos in the Zoom chat. Thanks everyone for coming out this morning. Uh, Today I'm going to be talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, which represent the effort by the international community to sort of think about progress in a fairly broad and comprehensive way. I'm going to start out by sort of looking at where they came from, sort of the thinking that went into development of the Sustainable Development Goals themselves, and then we'll look at assessing the progress that we've made in achieving those goals so far. Um, so that's sort of where we're going today. I want to start with a bit of background on the Sustainable Development Goals, kind of more generally. And I think to understand the Sustainable Development Goals themselves, we need to step back and think for a moment about two sort of related items. The first is this question of sustainable development itself. In other words, what do we mean by sustainable development in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals? And so if we're thinking about the concept of sustainable development, we can actually trace the origins in the context of the United Nations, trace the origins of the idea of sustainable development to the 1972 United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, which met in Stockholm to articulate or to consider the rights of the family to a healthy and productive environment. The conference was an interesting one because it brought together 122 countries, which at the time represented nearly all of the sovereign members of the United Nations, but also brought in 19 different UN agencies and more than 400 intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations. So this was one of the first times that the international community sort of in a conscientious way brought in non-state actors to think about global problems like development. The conference also resulted in the Stockholm Declaration. That was the output document which came from the conference, which for the first time in international law recognized the right to a healthy environment. It also resulted in the creation of the United Nations Environment Program, which had as its mission to provide leadership, deliver science, and develop solutions to sort of a broad range of, at the time, a broad range of environmental challenges. Now, as a quick aside, one of the things that's students in my UN course often sort of grow frustrated with the lack of major successes on the part of the United Nations in addressing global challenges, particularly in the areas of development and security. And while I think it's important to acknowledge the real limits of the UN, particularly in recent years in addressing global climate change, the United Nations Environment Program, I think we can nevertheless point to some interesting successes that it's had over time since its founding. And in particular, I think we can look at least three. We could probably talk about some others, but we could point to the 1987 Montreal Protocol. For those who aren't familiar, the 1987 Montreal Protocol was intended to address the problem of ozone depletion, the hole in the global ozone layer that was caused by the release of chlorofluorocarbons into the environment. And the 1987 Montreal Protocol, a lot of folks point to as sort of being a prime example of successful international cooperation to address a global environmental challenge. The protocol resulted in binding reductions, limits, and then reductions of the release of chlorofluorocarbons in the environment. And as a result of that protocol, we've seen emissions decline, and the projection is that the ozone hole is shrinking and that sometime around 2050 it will be gone altogether. So that's one interesting success. The second we can point to is the 2013 Minamata Convention, in which countries agreed to eventually eliminate trade and stop production of mercury, which is intended to reduce the amount of mercury released into the environment. And the third is the UNEP Solar Loan Program, which has made solar power available to hundreds of thousands of folks living off the grid, particularly in the global south. The other interesting thing about UNEP is that it's the first UN agency to be headquartered in a country in the global south. Its headquarters are actually located in Nairobi, Kenya. So stepping back to the Stockholm Declaration, the 1972 Stockholm Declaration, uh, as I said before, this declaration expressed the intent of the international community, or the commitment of the international community, to work collectively to address a wide variety of environmental challenges. But what's interesting about the agreement is that it also highlights some emerging or sharp tensions between the global north and the global south around this idea of sustainable development. And these are debates that we see play out for years before, and indeed for years after this. We even see it in the context of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which addresses climate change issues today. Um, while the countries of the global north tended to frame environmental questions as one of preservation, that is, of protecting the natural world from encroachment of and degradation by people, the countries in the global south increasingly sought to connect the idea of environment with the question of development, and more broadly with global inequality. The connection is perhaps most famously summarized by the Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi when she addressed the Stockholm Conference in June of 1972. And as part of her speech, she says, "We do not wish to impoverish the environment any further, and yet we cannot for a moment forget the grim poverty of large numbers of people," leading to her to ask the question, "Are not poverty and need the greatest polluters?" Right. So this is an interesting reframing of the question of sustainable development. The final text of the Stockholm Declaration needs to be seen, I think, in the context of these tensions, right? It maintains a focus on questions of environmental preservation, but it also incorporates a broad array of issues in the final statement. Um, I think broadly we can conceptualize these under the banner of sustainable development, or maybe even environmental justice, because in the final declaration out of the conference, we see that the question of environmental degradation is linked directly to questions of global inequality between rich and poor, the lack of protection of human rights, and indeed, even the document even makes specific reference to the maintenance of apartheid in South Africa and systems of colonialism. Remember, in 1972, there were still a number of countries that were not independent states yet in the global south. They were still held as colonial possessions. And so it explicitly connects these concepts, these issues, with the question of sustainable development. So 10 years later, roughly 10 years later, in 1983, the UN convenes the Brundtland Commission, formerly known as the United Nations World Commission on Environment and Development. And it's at this conference, it's through the Brundtland Commission report that the concept of sustainable development is first sort of formally articulated. So it's moving beyond just sort of broad conceptions of how do we think about this intersection of environmental sustainability and economic development to a very clear definition of the concept. And in the Brundtland Commission report, sustainable development is defined as development, and you're probably familiar with this definition. It's the one that we hear all the time: development that meets the needs of the present generation without undermining the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And so, as I said, that becomes sort of the common definition for sustainable development. If we think about it another way, the report describes the environment as where we live, and development as what we do in attempting to improve our lot within that abode. Uh, Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Prime Minister of Norway, and the person who led the commission, described these two as inseparable. And so, from this perspective, we can see that the idea of sustainable development is rooted in two interconnected, if opposing, ideas, right? The first is this idea of meeting current needs, that in particular, meeting the needs of the world's poor, and that this should receive focused attention. And the second is this idea that there are limits imposed by a variety of forces that might include technology or social organization, or even more broadly, the environment, on our ability to meet those needs. And so the extent to which um, the extent to which we can meet those needs, meet the needs of the current in the context of those limiting factors, is the realm of this idea of sustainable development. And so, from this broad framework, we can see that three main pillars of sustainable development emerge, right? The first is economic growth, this idea that Development has historically been rooted in resource extraction or often in unsustainable increases in levels of consumption, resulting in a challenge of finding ways to achieve economic growth necessary to improve the quality of life of the world's poor. The second is environmental protection, so ensuring that that economic growth does not come at the cost of environmental degradation. And the third is social equality or social equity, recognizing that resource consumption around the world is highly unequal, right? We see this often cited in a whole host of figures. 20% of the world's population consumes roughly 80% of its natural resources. 1% of the world's population owns about 40% of global wealth, and so on. And so it's in this area where these three factors coalesce that we're talking about sustainable development, right? So sustainable development occurs in sort of the nexus of these three factors. And so, again, this all harkens back to Indira Gandhi's address at the Stockholm meeting. She observes that it's an oversimplification to blame all the world's problems on increasing population. Countries with but a small fraction of the world's population consume the bulk of the world's minerals, fossil fuels, and so on. Thus, we see that when it comes to the depletion of natural resources and environmental pollution, the increase of one inhabitant in an affluent country at his level of living is equivalent to an increase of many Asians, Africans, or Latin Americans living at their current material level of living. From there, it's fairly straightforward to see how this idea of sustainable development, with all its limits and shortcomings, comes into being. So now, if we understand, at least in broad terms, the concept of sustainable development, we can turn to the second question, and that is understanding where the sustainable development goals themselves come from. And in the simplest terms, they evolved from an earlier agreement, an earlier articulation called the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs. The MDGs were a set of 8 goals articulated by the United Nations Millennium Declaration in the year 2000, and the 8 goals were supposed to be achieved by the year 2015. These goals included the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger, achieving universal primary education, promoting gender equality and empowering women, reducing child mortality, improving maternal health, combating HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, ensuring environmental sustainability, and developing a global partnership for development. Now, in the context of the Millennium Development Goals, each of the goals included specific targets and dates for achieving them. And they were broken down into specific targets and measures. So, for example, Goal 1, eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, included 3 targets. The first was halving between 1990 and 2015 the proportion of people living on less than $1.25 a day. The second was achieving decent employment for women, men, and young people. And the third was halving between 1990 and 2015 the proportion of people who suffer from hunger. In total, under the 8 goals, there were 21 targets, and each target in turn had one or more specific measures. So, for example, if we take target 1C here, having the proportion of people suffering from hunger, there were 2 specific measures that they used to assess progress in meeting this goal. The first was the prevalence of underweight children under the age of 5 years old, and the second was the proportion of the population below minimum level of dietary energy consumption. And so this structure was true of all 8 goals. Each was supported by specific targets, and each target had a specific number of measures by which progress was supposed to be assessed. And as we'll see in a couple of minutes, this structure of goals, targets, and measures is replicated in the Sustainable Development Goals. So the MDGs, or the Millennium Development Goals, were lauded for their transparency and for their inclusion of specific targets. Indeed, in many ways, the MDGs represented the first comprehensive effort to sort of think about development very broadly at the global level and to include specific targets and tracking of progress towards meeting those goals. But they were also criticized on a number of grounds. The first was that most of the measures used for evaluating progress and meeting the MDGs focused on global level statistics, which had the tendency of obscuring or obfuscating patterns within regional or local levels. So thus, while the international community was successful in meeting target 1A of having the world's population living on less than $1.25 a day, Most of that progress was actually the result of rapid economic growth in China, and improvements in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, by contrast, was much, much slower. And so the problem of measuring progress at a global level hid these kind of regional variations. The second criticism was that the Millennium Development Goals didn't pay sufficient attention to questions of environmental sustainability, particularly in the context of global climate change. So we have MDG 7, which was supposed to focus very broadly on environmental sustainability, but in practice, it was largely operationalized in terms of things like biodiversity loss or improved access to water and sanitation or stopping deforestation. And so, as we'll see in a couple of minutes when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the shift was to offer a much broader and in some ways more ambitious framework under the SDGs for thinking about this intersection of development and environment. The third criticism that was offered or leveled against the Millennium Development Goals was that there was a lack of acknowledgement of the interconnections between the various goals. And this played out in a couple of different ways. The first was that achievement or progress in one area, say, for example, in improving female employment, could often result in improvements in other areas like reducing child mortality or reducing the transmission of HIV/AIDS. There were a number of studies in different countries around the world that confirm precisely these kinds of connections. So we see from a study in Tanzania that improved female participation in the workforce led to a reduction in domestic violence. A study in Bangladesh talked about the way in which female employment led to empowerment of women in the political sphere or the public sphere. And in Mexico, we see studies that show a direct connection between female employment and improved household nutrition. But the problem with the Millennium Development Goals was that they tended to treat each of these goals as discrete variables, leading to some missed opportunities to think about how these positive connections might reinforce one another. And relatedly, the lack of understanding of the connection between the various goals led to some trade-offs taking place in development planning. So, for example, in many countries, the focus on improving primary school enrollment or achieving universal primary school enrollment, which was MDG, Millennium Development Goal number 2, led to actually a transfer of funding from secondary and higher education to primary education rather than an increase in overall spending on education. And so some of observers talk about a policy myopia that emerges, meaning that countries were focused on achieving the specific targets articulated in the Millennium Development Goals and ignoring both these positive connections and trade-offs between objectives that emerge. And more broadly, this policy myopia tended to narrow the focus away from kind of these broad overarching issues like the protection of human rights or achievement of gender equality and towards, as I said, these specific measurable targets. So, nevertheless, I think we can look at the Millennium Development Goals and find that they do indeed result in achievement of some important milestones. And so, in the final report on the Millennium Development Goals, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the time argued that the global mobilization behind the Millennium Development Goals has produced the most successful anti-poverty movement in history. And so I think we can look at, and this report indeed articulates some of the successes of the MDGs. For example, in reducing extreme poverty, defined as the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day, we see actually a decline in global extreme poverty from about 47% of the world's population living in extreme poverty in 1990 to about 14% by 2015. So that's a pretty dramatic reduction. We also see reductions in the number of undernourished people in the world. We see improvement in primary school enrollment. And we also see some pretty significant progress in some basic health measures, including things like reducing child mortality, expanding vaccination rates, improving maternal health, and reducing the transmission of HIV/AIDS. That said, the report also acknowledges that progress was uneven, particularly between different regions of the world, and that several areas were going to come in well below target goals. Specifically, the final report points to a failure to reduce gender inequality, to reduce intra-country inequality, particularly between rural and urban areas in individual countries, the failure to address global climate change and environmental degradation, the lack of reduction in global conflict or the implementation of measures to protect refugees and displaced persons, and the failure to improve access to basic services for the world's poor. And so out of that sort of critical reflection on the Millennium Development Goals, in 2015, the United Nations adopts the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, as the successor agreement to the Millennium Development Goals. And the SDGs in many ways sought to continue those successes and to address the shortcomings and criticisms that were leveled against the MDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals are far more ambitious and expansive. They include 17 goals rather than the 8 that were included under the MDGs. And again, each goal is supported by various targets and indicators or measures. What's interesting about the Millennium Development Goal, or excuse me, what's interesting about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they also address some of these broader challenges that were leveled against the SDGs, or the MDGs, excuse me, I keep doing that. Broadly speaking, the Sustainable Development Goals were supposed to be guided by 3 broad principles that apply in an overarching way to each of the 17 specific goals. These broad overarching goals or recognitions or principles include universality, this idea that the goals need to apply to every country and will require a mobilization across all sectors of society. The idea of integration, right? That is that recognition that the goals are all interconnected and that progress should be made on all goals, not just some set of them. And transformation, right? The idea that, or the belief that achieving the goals is going to require some fundamental changes in human society, particularly in social, political, and economic order. And so let's break that down a little bit. Let's look just very briefly at the goals themselves. And as I said, there were 17 of them. Ending poverty, ending hunger, ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being at all ages, ensuring equitable and inclusive quality education, achieving gender equality and empowering women and girls, ensuring the availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation, ensuring access to clean and affordable energy, promoting sustained and sustainable economic growth, building resilient infrastructure, reducing income inequality between and within countries, making cities sustainable, ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns, addressing climate change, protecting the oceans, ensuring environmental sustainability, achieving peace and justice, and strengthening partnerships to implement these specific goals. We can think about in some ways these goals as, there's 17 of them, so they get kind of unwieldy at times, and oftentimes you'll see them broken down into what are called the 5 Ps or 5 groups. The first are focused on people, so these are the goals that deal primarily with improving the life of the individual, so reducing poverty, eliminating hunger, those sorts of things. The second set of goals deal with sort of broadly the planet, environmental quality, and sustainability. These are goals 6, 12, 13, 14, and 15. The third set deal with prosperity, broadly thinking about questions of development in the economy. So these are goals 7 through 11. The fourth is peace, and the 5th is partnership. So you'll often see the Sustainable Development Goals broken down in this way as well. Now, as I said, as with the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals are broken down into specific targets and measures. And I won't go into a great deal of detail on this, but I'll just sort of briefly pick out Sustainable Development Goal number 1 to give you an example of this. So under SDG 1, there are 5 outcome targets. So eradicating extreme poverty, reducing all poverty, implementing social protections, ensuring rights of ownership and access to basic services, and building resilient building resilience to environmental, economic, and social disaster. Those are the 5 what are called outcome targets. In addition, there's 2 means of achieving targets. So these are basically how we're going to try to do this. This is mobilization of resources to end poverty and establishing poverty eradication frameworks at the national level. And so if you're interested, you can find a complete list of all of these targets and measures online. The Sustainable Development Goals site of the United Nations website has all of these broken down. And so within this context, as I said, each measure, each target is supported by specific measures. And so again, if we just focus on, say, 1.2, the reduction of all poverty by half, we see that this is supposed to be assessed by two measures. The first is the proportion of population living below the national poverty line by sex and age. And the second is the proportion of men, women, and children at all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions according to national definitions. And so, as I said, each target is supported by, or each measure is supported by these specific targets. So in all, the 17 goals are supported by 169 different targets and 232 unique indicators that are supposed to provide a comprehensive framework for thinking about these questions of sustainable development. And I think importantly for our purposes here, progress towards meeting those goals is closely tracked by the United Nations itself, as well as by a number of outside non-governmental organizations like the group Our World in Data. So then how are we doing, right? Are we making progress in achieving these goals? Are we going to achieve them? And I think here the evidence, probably as you would sort of speculate, is highly mixed. I think we can broadly classify the 17 goals into four broad groups. In the first, we have those goals for which we're on target. We're making considerable progress. We appear to be on track to meet them. In the second, we can think about those goals for which progress is being made in some regions of the world, but not in others. These are the goals that will likely be met by some countries, but not by others. In the third, we have the goals for which we're behind on all or most regions of the world. These are the goals that we're not likely to meet. And then in the fourth category, we have the goals for which we just don't have enough data to ascertain a specific pattern or to draw an assessment about where we might wind up. And so where are we on the goals here? Here, to conclude, I'm just going to give you sort of my very brief general sense at the moment, recognizing that unanticipated events like the COVID pandemic, for example, are likely going to affect progress. But at least to start, I think we can say that we're on target to meet goals 7, access to clean energy, and 4, universal education. We've seen some pretty significant progress in rural electrification, thanks in part to that solar energy program that I mentioned earlier, but also more broadly, the wider availability of solar, micro hydro, and other forms of alternative energy. And progress in ensuring universal access to education, particularly primary education, has been really strong across most regions of the world. I'd probably place goals 3, 5, and 6, so health, gender equity, and water and sanitation in this group as well, although these goals might be on the border with this uneven progress, given sort of the unequal distribution. These are goals that we're probably going to meet in nearly every region of the world, but we may not, so we have to pay attention to those. Progress in achieving goal 1, the elimination of poverty, has been pretty uneven. We've seen lots of progress towards meeting this goal, particularly in Asia, while large parts of Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East are falling behind. So, this is an example of one of those goals for which we've seen some pretty uneven progress. And we see similar uneven progress in goal 8, economic growth, 9, sustainable infrastructure, 16, peace, and 17, institutional partnerships. And in all these areas, it seems likely that some regions and countries will meet the targets while others will not. For several goals, particularly goal 2, ending hunger, will likely be met in China, but not elsewhere. And most of the environmental goals, goal 12, 11, sustainable cities, 12, sustainable consumption, 13, climate, and 15, protecting life on land, likely will not be met. And then finally, we don't have enough information, I think, to evaluate goals 10 and 14, which are intra-country inequality and reducing or protecting sea life. And so, as I said, there's a whole host of challenges that remain. A lot of analysis argue that everything is kind of dependent on meeting goal 1, eliminating extreme poverty and reducing poverty more broadly, and we're not making sufficient progress on that. There's also the cost associated with achieving all of these targets. Some of the estimates place the cost of achieving all of the goals in the neighborhood of $2.5 to $3 trillion a year. And that funding is simply just not available anywhere near that. And then the third challenge that we currently see is the COVID crisis, which remains sort of an obstacle to progress, particularly over the last year or so. And so that's what I have to share with you. I'm happy to spend some time answering questions, thinking about this together. And I will turn it back over to Sarah. Thanks.